many biotechs these days, they're able to transform themselves into commercial businesses, and so retain as much value from their assets as possible. And they do that by focusing on orphan indications. In your experience, what are the sort of the key business questions that that a company would have to address, if it was looking to sort of exploit that orphan opportunity?
Sure. So when biotechs come to us and when they have an orphan indication, then very oftentimes the question that the most important question is, yes, we understand that this asset is indicated for an orphan indication, but can you give us a sense of what the addressable patient population is? And that's oftentimes not a very straightforward question to answer, because whilst sizing an orphan population on the surface is relatively straightforward, one has to consider a number of different dimensions. For example, line of therapy. That can impact your addressable patient population. What could also impact your patient population could be a treatment protocol or a treatment guideline. That means that your asset is in some ways limited to a certain population, which you may not have trialed the asset for as part of your baseline plan. Other issues related to sizing an addressable population relate to challenges with diagnosis, challenges pinpointing those diagnosed patients and bringing them to a center of care. So a lot of issues related to just how big is my patient pool is a significant step one question, right? Following that, once we've addressed the question of how big is my target patient pool, how sizable is the opportunity, then comes the question of how do I actually engage that patient pool? How do I activate that patient pool? And how can I get that patient pool to clinic? And once they're in clinic, on my therapy? And that presents another significant strategic question that oftentimes orphan companies may not have all the answers for, and that's where we support them. Once that question is addressed, there's the obvious question of how do I optimize the pricing and access environment for my asset, and how do I, in conjunction with price and access, get my asset to market as fast as possible. And getting that triangle of price, time, and volume right is in some ways the magic triangle. And that's what orphan companies oftentimes, I wouldn't say struggle to get right, but they do oftentimes require support. And that's where we come in. And once we've addressed those, what I would call revenue line questions, then we come to the cost side of the equation. And oftentimes clients do ask us for our views or our recommendations on what the commercial strategy should look like, what their commercial infrastructure should look like, what the access infrastructure should look like, what that translates to into operating expenses, and ultimately what that translates to into their NPV. And all of those are areas where we support our clients.
Okay, so the outcomes that there are these sort of specific questions, and then you will be sort of delivering some answers. So what does that sort of that delivery look like? I mean, can you give us for instance?
Sure. So as an example, we worked with a company that was in phase 3 for an orphan indication. And it was an interesting indication in that there hadn't been a lot of clinical development or innovation in that indication for a number of years. Our client had a novel formulation. It was differentiated. It had a clear benefit in terms of convenience. It had a clear benefit in terms of its efficacy. However, their clinical trial wasn't optimized for markets outside of the US. And what that meant is that they needed to then take a strategic decision on, one, whether to adapt their clinical development program to meet the requirements of regulators and payers in Europe. And that meant investment, right? And before making that investment, they actually wanted to understand whether the commercial opportunity in Europe was actually big enough for them to then consider that investment. So that was the problem case. What we did was as I mentioned earlier, a sequential drill down of the commercial opportunity for the asset. So we looked at the epidemiology. They had certain estimates of prevalent diagnosed and incident population that were subject to some discrepancies. And we did a thorough literature review. We spoke to KOLs, looked at registry information, and got a better sense of what that addressable patient pool was. We then looked at the competitive environment. As I mentioned, most of the therapies in the indication were in some ways legacy therapies. Generics were coming into the market. That meant additional competitive threat, not just from the incumbent innovators, but also from generics. And as we all know, in Europe, once generics come in, even if they're not head-to-head competitors from a formulation perspective, payers do consider them as your competitor, and that impacts your price potential. So we looked at KOL and payer perceptions of the asset. We conducted analog analysis, understood what the likely price corridor for the reformulation would be, and basis the analysis on the patient pool, basis the analysis on the competitive landscape and the potential competitive threat or share that the asset could get, and the analysis of pricing and access potential. We got to a fairly robust scenario-based assessment of the revenue potential of the asset. As I mentioned before, looked at what kind of access and commercial infrastructure would be required, and gave them a scenario-based assessment of what they might realize in terms of profit should they go ahead and commercialize in Europe. And this gave them a much better sense of what they might realize if they made the investment in the clinical development program versus a competitor, as opposed to a placebo in the US. So they're now in that process of considering their next phase development program for Europe. And the recommendations were I would say, appreciated by senior management, because they got clarity. They could provide their board clarity. They could provide investors clarity as to what their strategy for Europe would be. And as you can imagine, that is a key question for biotechs in the US, and that's what we happen to specialize in.